Vamos começar o painel aqui de fusões verticais. Eu vou mudar para inglês. A gente está com 2 palestrantes da Europa, então a gente vai fazer nosso painel de hoje em inglês. Então eu vou começar aqui a fazer a explicação do nosso painel de hoje. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss this hot topic on vertical mergers. So today we are going to talk about the updates, economic analysis, and the relevance of having a merger guidelines. Before you move on to our discussion, I just want to thank Cade, in the name of Sofia, for the opportunity to give into IBRAC to work together in the Vertical Integration Working Group. It's a pleasure for IBRAC to participate and contribute to that. IBRAC's working group started last year, motivated by our former President Lauro Celidônio, and this year had more than 50 collaborators, mainly coordinated by Adriana Pérez, Vivian Fraga, Bruno Droghetti, Isabela Passos, Ana Olímpia, Ana Binotto, and many others. One of the works carried out by was to compile Cade national jurisprudence in case of vertical mergers. I just want to show a very short presentation on some statistics before we start our discussion, just to show some work that IBRAC, together with Cade, has conducted this year. So if you can just put in your slides for a moment, and then I'm going to just show this work, and then you're going to present your speakers over here. Tá muito baixo? So it's better now. Sorry. So you have a presentation here. If you could just move on. In your work presentation here, you can just... Pode passar, por favor. Sorry. So you have here, as I said, the IBRAC working group worked together with Cade, and was coordinated by Adriana, Vivian, and many others here. And we have a compilation of some vertical integration case. You have here, it was more than 1,468 cases involving vertical mergers were identified under the new law. Of each, 61 were received by the court. So if you have the case here, it's just a really short presentation, just showing how was the main theories of harm. So if you take in consideration the 61 case that Cade, the tribunal, the court actually has analyzed, you have mainly the theory of harms. If you take in consideration the proportion of case, mainly you have the theory of harm of foreclose in 73%. Other was the discrimination, coordinated effects, access of sensitive information, razor costs, and others portfolio and conglomerate effects. And if you take in consideration only one tier of harm, the mark foreclose is more than 30%. So I think it's just to have an idea. The work conducted from IBRAC has more content. And here we can see some proportion of case per company and sectors. So if you can see here, the manufacturing industry concentrates most of the intra-sector mergers in 43%. And if you take in consideration, most of the cases are between parties that belong to the semi-macro sector in 82%. So here, just you have a short presentation here, and the last one, and you consider the remedies, the frequency of remedies in this 61 case in vertical mergers. 27% were approved subject to remedies that was addressed in the vertical integration concerns. So I'm just gonna move to our speakers here, and before I'm just introduce everybody here. You have Ioannis, Professor Ioannis and Hans Zenger. They are unable to be here, but thank you so much to participate in your panel today. And without further ado, I pass the word to Ana Sofia. Our panel today, we're going to have a short presentation for each of the speakers, and then we're going to move on to debate. So Ana Sofia, she's the Antitrust General Coordinator at Cade, Superintendence and Coordinator of the Cade Working Group, responsible for the development of the first vertical mergers analysis guidelines, together with Daniele Knapp. Sofia holds a degree in Law, Economics, and International Relations, a Master in Business Administration, and currently she's a PhD candidate in Commercial Law at USP. She also serves as a Professor of Economics and Corporate Law at Instituto Direito Público. Sofia, you have the word to open your speech.
Thank you, Fabi. Thank you, IBREC, for this opportunity. And thank you for the General Superintendent, Mr. Barreto, for the opportunity to go ahead with the works in the Cade's working group in vertical restraints. So just to give you a brief, I was actually asked by Fabi to give a brief context of the issue of vertical integration worldwide, and then talk a little bit about the developments of our working group. So the year of 2022 saw both the EU and the UK overruling their current regimes governing vertical merger agreements, both of them focused on the treatment of vertical restraints. In terms of merger control, according to the 2018 ICN Vertical Merger Survey report, the most recent one, conducted through a joint effort with the CMA, 27 out of the 44 competition authorities that have responded to the survey claim to have published their own merger guidelines. From these 27, almost 80% of them were already addressing the issue of vertical mergers. Although we unfortunately don't have an updated picture of this ratio, and trust me, we are actually trying to stimulate supply here, in recent years, we know that several countries have developed some kind of guidelines on vertical restraints, be it in general or certain specific vertical restraints in particular. For instance, Germany in 2017, Switzerland in 2017, the Netherlands in 2019, Ireland in 2021, and Slovak Republic in 2021, just to name some. Also, authorities from the US, the US, birthplace of antitrust, are conducting careful reviews of the horizontal merger guidelines and the vertical merger guidelines. According to the DOJ, these documents are designed to provide increased transparency and guidance to the public on how the department makes law enforcement decisions. The first US vertical merger guidelines was published in 1968 and updated in 1984. Although the US guidelines jointly issued by the DOJ and the FTC are usually updated every 15 years, the 1984 version was only updated more recently in 2020. However, on the 15th of December 2021, by a 3-2 vote, the FTC withdrew the vertical merger guidelines in order to work on a robust public engagement process to seek comment on ways it could be improved. The current discussions have been motivated by a recent challenge in September 2021, as I told, led by Commissioners Khan, Chopra, and Slaughter, who have claimed that the efficiency defense arguments contained in the 2020 V-Guide version were actually against the Clayton Act. Both documents are expected to be released by the end of this year. Following the challenge, which has happened literally 16 months after the last updated guide has been published, there has been a request for information on merger enforcement, beginning in January this year, in order to collect public comments on how to modernize public legislation on merger control in the US. Also, the European Commission has just released the final version of the new vertical block exemption regulation, the VBA, and vertical guidelines, which entered into force on the 1st of June 2022. The document followed a thorough evaluation and review of the 2010 rules. The revised rules have also made simpler, clearer, and up-to-date in order to provide business with more accessible rules and guidance. especially to those who use them in their day-to-day business. The revised Weber rules, in particular, have been clarified and simplified. It has been updated with regard to assessment of online restrictions, vertical agreements in the platform economy, and agreements to pursue sustainability objectives, among others. That's the context in the world. Let's come back to Brazil. The idea of a Brazilian vertical restraints working group was originated in my general coordination responsible for analyzing mergers in service markets, which includes, but is not restricted to, health and financial services. Together with Ms. Danielle Kinep, an enthusiastic Cade civil servant with a lot of experience in the issue, we thought about creating an internal discussion group, which eventually became a large project involving 8 voluntary national and international keynote speakers, around 30 Cade civil servants from the General Superintendents, the Tribunal, and the Department of Economic Studies and the Federal Public Ministry, around 20 hours of high-level discussions, and the very welcoming help of IBREC Vertical Merger Working Group, composed of around 50 voluntaries represented here in the person of Mr. Tito. Along the discussions we had during these many meetings, it became very clear the need for a Brazilian guide on vertical mergers. First, due to the many doubts on identifying the very existence of vertical integration in different production chains, and second, because of the need to address the different and little obvious anti-competitive problems emerging from such movements, like vertical restraints and exchange of sensitive information. On Monday, we had finally finished this productive pathway of discussions with a complete index of topics that should be addressed in our future Brazilian V-Guide, as I can say. A draft version of this document is expected to be delivered by December 2022. As the leading competition authority in the region and among the best agencies in the world, the results from these discussions we had from Cade's working group not only reflect the excellence of our team and the quality of our leadership, but also the incredible contributions of our own case law.
Thanks a lot, Sofia. So now I move on to Hans Zenger. Hans Zenger is head of unit of chief economists of the European Commission. He has led the economics analysis in a large number of high-profile merger and antitrust decisions. Prior to joining the European Commission, Hans was a vice president at CRA. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Munich and a master in economics from Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Han has published on competition economics in journals such as International Journal of Industrial Organization and Antitrust Law. By the way, yesterday, one of his paper was mentioned in Cade decision yesterday. So, Hans, you have the words.
No, I just said muito obrigado pelo convite, muito obrigado for your nice words. So, In Europe, we have had vertical merger guidelines with an effects-based approach basically since 2008, and these guidelines were mentioned by Sofia before, and I think they were at the time the first guidelines in the world that were fully effects-based. As has been mentioned, there has been a very interesting process in the US. The US has issued guidelines, but then withdrawn them. Ours are still in place. So I think our guidelines, even though, of course, after 14 years, maybe not every word is exactly like you would do it in every single situation. So, I mean, clearly, if we were to publish new guidelines, they would be slightly revised. I think by and large, we still follow the principles that are set out there. So even though it's a quite old document, it's still a good basis. And so the basis of this document is essentially to focus mostly on foreclosure. And the test that the European Commission applies there has traditionally been one of three elements. We have to show that there is an ability to foreclose from the merging firms. We have to show that there is an incentive to foreclose. And we have to show that such a foreclosure would likely lead to harm to competition and to consumers in the market. Now, how do we look at these, especially also from an economic perspective? So for ability, the first thing that we usually look at is how critical the input is that we're talking about. So if we have a vertical transaction and some input merges with some downstream product, we want to know how important is this product for the downstream rivals of the merged entity. So that has two aspects. First of all, is there some market power? So, is it difficult for rivals to find alternatives for the input? And the second element of this is, generally, is it important input? So is it something that could be leveraged in order to gain market power on the downstream market? Then after we've looked at that, I think the next thing we usually look at is the incentive. And the incentive, there we look at two things mostly. I mean, first of all, we want to know, if this input was foreclosed, so if rivals would not get access anymore to this input, would such foreclosure lead to a lot of diversion of demand to the downstream entity? So if I have a vertical integration with Ioannis's company, and then afterwards do not provide this input anymore to Ioannis's rivals, I want to know, how many of the rival customers would switch to Ioannis, given that now they don't have access to my product anymore with the rival. And of course, that depends on how important is the downstream product and the upstream product. If I have a very rare and scarce product as an input, whereas the downstream products, they are relatively exchangeable, then a lot of people will switch. The second element that's important there is that my downstream partner has to make some money for such diversion to be profitable. So if I merge with Ioannis, but Ioannis's downstream product is not really making any much money, then there's not much sense in me trying to move people over to Ioannis, because it's such a competitive market. I make the money rather where I am already upstream. Then the final thing that we look at is effect, and effect, that can be shown, or that we try to show in different ways. Effect could be that, for instance, if there would be foreclosure, that there would be a large foreclosure rate, so that we would think that a lot of people would lose access to the product. It could be, for instance, if we engage in some quantitative analysis, that we believe that there's a high price increase that is going to follow after the merger. And of course, also we have to consider efficiencies potentially, which may be there. So overall, we take all these elements into account, and then we see, what are the alternatives of customer? Maybe there are many other people who are vertically integrated, so foreclosure of one or two independent people would not harm competition a lot. Now, to give an example of where we applied this relatively recently, I want to mention a merger that is called Telia-Bonnier. It's a merger that was in Northern Europe for a TV channel company that had several, very important TV channels for the Swedish and Finnish viewers. And they were merging with a provider of TV channels, so with a telecoms company. So it's a bit the same situation as it was in AT&T and Time Warner that you may know from the US, which was the first big US vertical case that they have brought in decades, and then they lost. So this Telia-Bonnier case is very similar. It's a similar setup. It's an important channel upstream. And the question was, will there be foreclosure? Now, how would it work? So this channel was very important. And we had internal documents from the companies where they had made an own analysis where they said, look, if the TV distributors don't have access to our channel, they will lose a lot of viewers, because the viewers, they consider our channel very important. And so they had made actually some simulations, seeing how over time lack of access would lead to customers switching away from their channel. So we could use that then to argue, okay, it's a critical channel. We also know if access to this channel is not given, then a lot of people downstream will switch. And after the merger, there are different incentives, because after the merger, pre-merger, if I'm the dominant TV channel, of course I want to sell my TV channel. So I do not want to negotiations to break down. I want to sell it. But post-merger, I will know, well, in case negotiations break down, at least, a lot of people will switch to my new downstream partner and watch the channel there. And so I can be much more aggressive in the bargaining. And so we used a bargaining model, a quantitative bargaining model, which predicted that there would be significant price increases after the merger. And we used the data of the companies themselves for this. And so in the end, we concluded there would be a risk of foreclosure. And so the case was solved with remedies. The parties had to commit, I think, for 10 years to provide access to this channel, without charging an extra fee for the merger to clear. So that was an example of how we approach it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hans, for your speech in terms of ability and incentives. And then I move to Commissioner Luiz Braido. Commissioner Braido holds a degree in economics from University of São Paulo, master in economics from Fundação Getúlio Vargas and University of Chicago, and a PhD in economics from University of Chicago. He's also an associate professor at FGV in the Brazilian School of Economics and Finance. Commissioner, you have the word.
Thanks. So let me start by thanking the organizers for the invitation, Fabiana for this kind of introduction and for organizing this panel, panelists for taking part in the debate, and the audience for being here, right? Thank you. It's a real privilege to be here. So let me start by take one step back. So before we discuss vertical analysis guidelines, let us think about what we have. We have an horizontal merger guidelines, and this has been useful for over 20 years for analyzing horizontal mergers. And it's built on solid economic background and economic foundation. And it is presented as a step-by-step procedure that anyone could follow, even if you don't have a clue what is behind it. So the first question I pose is, can we do something like that for vertical mergers? And I hope we have a chance to go through that question. So let me point a little bit about the theories behind the horizontal merge guidelines. So, as I said, it is a step-by-step procedure to be followed. So you start with the definition of relevant markets. Well, that is basically built on the hypothetical monopolies test, or primarily built on that, and which is built on the monopoly theory, which is back from the 18th century. I mean, the work by Carl Menger. So solid theory and quite clear guidelines such that you don't need to know anything about that to follow and define the relevant market. Once you have it defined, you move to concentration levels, and you analyze market shares and Herfindahl-Hirschner index. And why you do that? Well, you do that because you have a bunch of oligopoly theory, starting with Cournot in the 18th century, Bertrand also in the 18th century, and the modern versions of Bertrand games with limited capacity and differentiate goods. All these models predict that markups are proportional to market share. So when you have a merge, you expect to have higher levels of market shares for the merged firms, so you expect to have increasing markups. Well, markups is basically the difference between prices and costs. If you don't have efficiencies that reduce costs, the only way the most expected result of the merge would be increasing prices. So that's why we worry. There's a direct effect on consumer and as a consequence on consumer welfare. Well, all those theories are based on games with a fixed number of players. Then you should ask whether there is incentive for entry of new players, or entry in extensive margin, new players, or in the intensive margins, current players building new factories or new capabilities. Again, this is based on monopolistic competition theory, and more recently on dynamic entry games. And you have, as I said, a step-by-step procedure in which you don't need to know what is behind, and you can do the analysis and move on. And then it goes on. After you analyze unilateral effects, you should analyze efficiencies. In my personal view, I think efficiency should be in the beginning, right together with concentration levels. Remember, markups are the difference between prices and costs. If you have efficiency can offset higher levels of concentration. So, by reducing costs, you increase markup by reducing costs, not by increasing price. So that is something you should, in my view, should be analyzed together. But anyway, for historical reasons, efficiency was put in the fourth place of the analysis, and that's how we do. And we move to coordinated power, purchasing power. Coordinated power is based on the theory of monopoly again, and purchasing power is built on the theory of monopsony. Okay, so then it comes the question. So we have a horizontal merger guidelines, which establish a step-by-step procedure with clear theory foundation on the back. Can we do that for the vertical analysis? Is it that simple? Do we have a solid theory behind it? So I don't want to extend myself. I believe I'll have a chance to go back to those topics, but I think this is pretty much the tone I'd like to set for the discussion. What should it include in the guide? And how should we write this guide? Is really guidelines for dummies? Anyone can go there and follow? Or no, it's going to be just like a collection of big ideas, open ideas, so that we organize our mindset when we start to discuss. And clearly there will be difficulties to do something so close and step-by-step as the horizontal merger. So just anticipating things that will come later.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. I think it's a really nice speech on that. So then you move on to Professor Ioannis. Professor Ioannis is a professor in competition law and economics at Queen Mary University of London, and also director of Center of Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary. Professor holds a bachelor degree in economics, University of Essex, master in economics in Cambridge, LLM in Warwick, and a PhD in competition law for King's College London, and also a postdoc in visiting research in Harvard Law School. Professor Ioannis has formerly served as UK Competition and Markets Authority, DJ Competition, European Commission, US FTC, and also he's a special advisor to several competition authorities globally. Thanks a lot, Ioannis. So we have the word to start your opening speech.
Thanks to IBRAC for the invitation. I'm lucky to come after Hans, because Hans actually outlined the approach in European, by the European Commission, but it's also the approach that is followed in the UK. So I don't have to go through the same type of analysis because the UK, as many other countries outside the EU, not just within the EU, are actually following the type of approach the EU guidelines have. So when it comes to Brazil thinking about your own guidelines, you don't have to imitate what Brussels is doing, but you probably can consider taking some best practices from what Brussels has done and other authorities have done based on these guidelines and how they enforce them. So focusing on the UK guidelines are very similar to European Commission's. They date back to earlier than the 2010. We had the first joint guidelines between the two competition authorities we had at the time in the UK. Now we have one competition authority. We have new guidelines a few years ago, 4 years ago. But the approach to vertical mergers has not actually changed. So the criteria are identical. The approach to how we assess them is identical. What has changed in the UK are two things. One, there was a change in the legislation last year, actually 2 years ago. And that was in response to criticisms that the current regime is not able to actually address some of the new developments in markets globally. So we have a new set of changes in the UK regime which focused on how we can enforce the competition law and market control in digital markets, but also how we can actually improve aspects of consumer law and consumer enforcement. There was also a reconsideration of the thresholds for notification. So now there is a different set of thresholds to be more realistic to, on the one hand, to the current type of turnover generated by companies and whether they should be, the turnover threshold should be increased or not. So there was an increase in the turnover threshold, but at the same time, there was also a widening of the jurisdictional net in relation to types of deals or acquisitions that would be considered killer acquisitions in the global merger control system. When it comes to vertical mergers, a change we have seen over time is the enforcement. So we have seen more and more cases, not just in the digital sector, we'll come back to that, we have seen more and more cases actually being being investigated in more detail and actually going into phase 2. So if I can focus just in some of the major cases in the non-digital markets, and I will come back later on the digital markets, in the last few years, we had, for example, in 2017, we had a vertical merger in the pork supply chain, and that's a Tulip Easy transaction. The theory of harm there, as in vertical mergers, was that of foreclosure of entry, but also foreclosure in the ability to expand. And the authority there, the CMA there, actually assessed to what extent there is any potential harm that can arise in the markets from this foreclosure. And it also, even though we're talking about pork supply chain, the CMA also considered aspects of the impact of the transaction and the impact of foreclosure on innovation. And so we are talking here about it as traditional market as it gets, pork supply chain, where the CMA went into a lengthy analysis of vertical issues and to what extent you could have foreclosure in this market. Then again, in 2017, we had a transaction, we had a deal between Heineken, the beer company, and Punch. Punch is a chain of pubs in the UK. And again, here the concern was to what extent a merger between a major brewer and a large pub network could lead to foreclosure on both upstream and downstream market. So both the beer supply market, but also the pub market. And the transaction was cleared in phase 1, but the CMA again took a detailed account of the foreclosure theories and any other potential foreclosure, even partial foreclosure that we can have in these markets. And the last case, which I will touch on of a non-digital nature, is Tesco Booker, which was a merger again 2017. 2017 seems to be a really active year in relation to vertical mergers for the CMA. So 2017, where you had the merger between a grocery retailer and a grocery wholesaler. Now, because of the names, Tesco is one of the largest supermarket chains in the UK. That transaction actually had a lot of press focus. So it raised a lot of eyebrows to what extent this can actually lead to problems in the supply of competing supermarkets. So again, CMA followed the standard type of foreclosure analysis, followed its guidance. It's the same exact guidance that Hans mentioned and described for the EC. But this case actually had two interesting aspects. One, that case was fast-tracked into phase 2. So the parties in notification discussion with the CMA realized that the CMA will probably not be able to clear it, far from it in phase one. So they decided, let's drop is the wrong phrase here. Let's fast forward phase one. Let's go into phase two. Let's go into detail. Let's see how we can actually sort the case out. At the end of the process, the case was cleared without any conditions, but it's not very likely that in the last, let's say, in the UK, and I would argue in Brussels, but Hans, correct me here, in the last kind of 30 years of merger enforcement in Brussels, we don't really see that many phase two vertical cases which then are cleared unconditionally. So here we have a case, and Hans, thank you for making sure I don't make a mistake on this one. Thank you. So here we actually see CMA going into detail, phase two, vertical deal, still clearing unconditionally, but having to go through a detailed analysis, a lengthy analysis to make sure there's no foreclosure. So I can stop here on the CMA and I can touch later on US or digital markets as you deem suitable, Fabiana.
Okay, thanks so much, Professor Ioannis. It was a very nice speech on these case studies. So now we'll move on to the date. I'm going to ask Hans, when you talk about presumption in certain transaction, might be anti-competitive, what are merger screenings to be assessed in order, like market shares, the VGUP analysis, the VGUP test, actually? Should the agents consider alternative metrics or qualitative factors for determining presumption, the anti-competitive, having a screening analysis? Can you just talk about how is this conducted in European Commission?
Right. I think it depends a lot on whether one thinks about presumptions for harm or presumptions for no harm. In horizontal mergers, basically both exist. So if market shares are very low, there's a presumption of no harm. If market shares are extremely high, there's essentially a presumption of harm. Now, in vertical mergers, I think for the presumption of no harm, it's basically the same. If you have no market power, both upstream and downstream, so you have low market shares, low profit margins, many alternatives, and so forth, then I think there should, of course, be a presumption that normally there should be no problem. To make a presumption in the other direction in vertical mergers, namely to say, because two companies that merge have market power, we presume that the merger will be anti-competitive, is much more difficult. I think the US seems to intend to want to go a little bit in this direction back, as it was maybe in the 1950s in the US. But the principal concern with having such a presumption is that the efficiencies of vertical integration, which I think are quite well documented over the last 100 years, they tend to be also particularly strong when you have two strong companies that are integrated, because then you have so many potential market failures that can be reduced through the combination. So I don't think we work with a presumption of harm. Of course, there's a higher likelihood of harm, and so we investigate more carefully if we have market power, but we don't presume it. On the VGUPPs, I think the VGUPPs can be a useful element. I think Ioannis has mentioned a decision in the UK where it was used. We have used it, others have used it. But the VGUPPs, in my personal experience, tend to be actually quite complicated, and in the vertical case, much more complicated than in the horizontal case. And usually, in our experience, they're not so helpful for a screen. They're maybe helpful for a deep, full analysis. Now, I mentioned a few elements that we look at generally, perhaps just two final things on this. I think in terms of things that raise our alarm bells in addition to market power, and I think one is if you think about what would be the result of foreclosure, if the result of foreclosure would be, that competition is completely eliminated and not just prices raised a little bit, I think then we get really scared, and then we want to know very deeply. I think one example could be NVIDIA ARM, a case that was withdrawn but was scrutinized by agencies around the world, where the input of ARM, the underlying chip technology, the chip architecture for mobile chips and many other chips, if that would have been withdrawn from chip makers, it would have been a complete disaster and not just prices going up a little bit. So in these situations, I think, we have to be extra careful, and that for sure is for us a screen, if such an outcome is possible, that we say, well, we really have to dig very carefully on this.
Thanks a lot for that. Sofia, what's your thought based on the discussion within the Cade working group? Any other new thresholds that you think about it?
So as you probably already know, based on resolution 33 from 2022, actually the updated version, we use a threshold of 30% in either market. And we have been discussing on the possibility of considering a threshold for both, so that we would be more conservative in terms of what evolves to a non-fast track procedure. But it is important to say, especially to Ioannis and to Hans, that this is a threshold for separating what continues on the analysis as a fast track and as a non-fast track procedure. So the discussions now are to possibly be more conservative in what will evolve if we consider a threshold in both downstream and upstream market that are merging in the concrete case. We have asked Sabine from the OECD that has worked in the German Competition Authority, when she came to the discussion in the working group, where does the 30% come from? And we had no answer. That was very peculiar. So what we think on updating the thresholds is to give more attention to those vertical mergers that would really ring a bell. The second discussion we are currently having is on quantitative exercises. It is we come to a phase in vertical mergers that qualitative arguments, they kind of cross over. So we have a lot of qualitative arguments from one side and a lot of qualitative arguments from the other side, and we need to have some more quantitative exercises. And for that, we have also been discussing the possibility of having information on price margins from the beginning, not to use the VGAP as a first track, as a screening for a first track, and we have also discussed that, but to have that information. Oh, sorry, I'm probably screaming here, but as to have this information from the beginning, so that we won't evolve on the case and reach 170 days on the case analysis without this very important information that could subsidize that important exercise that was actually made in Tesco broker case cited by Ioannis. This was one of the CMA cases using VGAP as a quantitative measure during the analysis. So that's the current discussion.
Thanks so much, Sofia. It's very interesting discussion in terms of has a threshold in the both markets. So let's wait for the draft. Commissioner Bridle, mergers that may have substantially less competition or tend to create a monopoly as illegal, or even if they have some type of harms like foreclosure or rising river costs. Based on that, could you give us an overview in terms of the antitrust concern on vertical merging, and also which kind of economic analysis should be evaluated in terms of ability and incentives, and take in consideration both speech from Hans and Sofia as well?
Okay, thanks. So let's move to vertical mergers. So we're talking now about integration between firms acting in different layers of productive chain. So perhaps the question we should make before that is the question that Ronald Coase made in the 30s, 1930s, when there's a classical paper, I believe anyone interested in vertical merger should read. It is a paper without a lot of formulas, so then written in beautiful English, so it's very accessible, and he discusses about like the nature of the firm. What is a firm? What is its size should be? And on that extent, the underlying question is how much of the production should be made in-house and how much should be outsourced. So it's important we understand that, because we're going to deal with this phenomenon. I mean, outsourcing versus integrating from the firm's perspective and consequences on other firms in the market. So what Coase points out as two important forces to determine how much you do in-house and how much you outsource are two things. First, transaction costs. And I mean, is it cost to deal through contracts with suppliers, or it's cheaper to basically build it in-house? And the second thing is the extent of the market. So are there many suppliers there? So I'm trying to open a restaurant in Rio and I want to serve some mushrooms. Are there mushroom suppliers in Rio? So perhaps I should have a farm and produce mushrooms. But if I want to open the same restaurant, I don't know, let's say Provence, well, and then I don't think I'm going to do very good mushrooms as they do there. So, and there's going to be a lot of diversity. So the fact that there is a market for these inputs probably makes business in France, restaurant business in France, less integrated than they should be. I don't know, I'm just taking this example in Brazil, but I mean, just because we don't produce much different types of mushrooms here. But I mean, so those are the forces. And those forces will be behind. I mean, from time to time, you have shifts on the transaction cost, shifts on the extent of the market, and then there are going to be waves of mergers, vertical mergers. And that's totally rational from the efficiency perspective. So we should be very careful with regulating vertical mergers, because they are usually based on efficiency and the very nature of the firm. I mean, how much should we do inside? How much should you outsource? And when does that becomes a antitrust problem? So far, it's basically a business decision. Well, the point is that perhaps my mushroom supplier. So let's say that instead of buying a farm and producing mushrooms, I will go through the only producer of mushrooms around Rio, and I'll buy everything from him and write an exclusive contract, or perhaps I will buy the farm. Well, but then it's very efficient for my business, but perhaps nobody else can ever serve mushrooms again in restaurants around me. Not only the existing restaurants, as well as the others that are planning to open a restaurant. And perhaps I'm not the best cooker. I mean, I don't do mushrooms very well. So I'll be a monopolist just because I control the input source, not because I'm the most efficient. So we're essentially concerned with that phenomena, exclusionary and distortionary effects due to the merge. So that's what should be looking. Oh, and how those two things could show up. Oh, then there are going to be many different forms. Market foreclosure, discrimination. I just took a quick list of some of them. I don't intend to be extensive, but like imposing costs on competitors, refuse to deal, exclusive clauses, margin squeeze, tie-ins, and so on and so forth. So yes, so there are many different practices that we should look at, but our main concern is to avoid exclusionary and distortionary practice deriving from the merge. And let's think about the sector in which now let us think about a sector with three layers. We have the upstream, midstream, and downstream levels. Let's say the midstream firm decides to buy its supplier. Well, then the first thing you're going to worry is, well, can other firms in the midstream be able to buy from that supplier. Does this firm in the midstream has enough market power to foreclose this market? And that's why we have a threshold. I mean, it should probably be bigger than the threshold for horizontal mergers, because now you're not worried about price increase, I'm worried about closing the market. I don't know if it's 30%, 40%, or whatever, but I mean, there is a rationality on being a little bit bigger than the 20% that the law says is like the presumption for market power. So you need to have market power in some of the layers, otherwise you won't be able to do any of those practices. And do we need to have market power in both the midstream and upstream? Well, probably yes, but sometimes not. So sometimes the mushroom producers is in standard measures of market power will be like very small. And still, I mean, this is the key producer, the one that produces mushrooms in the perfect way. So you might want to have some a more qualitative approach to analyze whether you might be buying some must-have input, even though it doesn't have a lot of market power. So yes, market power in both markets are useful, but I'm not sure if would use that as a screen. And again, that would depend on the number of cases we get. If you don't get many vertical merger cases, then you can pursue more cases and just adopt the usual 30%. If you realize that there are so many cases, then we are not have enough resource for that, and we have to optimize and perhaps take care of less cases, and then the double standard for market power would be important. And just over time, right? So you ask about ability and incentives. So that's the point. You need to have a market power enough to be able to foreclosure, and you have to have incentives, because sometimes, I mean, selling mushrooms is so profitable that instead of having a restaurant, I decide to sell mushrooms to supermarkets and so on and so forth, and then everybody want to have access to my mushrooms. So perhaps I don't have incentives to close this market. And that takes back to what Sofia said about, well, perhaps you should take a closer look on margins. Well, this is definitely important, but it's also extremely dangerous. See, there is a reason why we don't look to margins, because it's very easy to manipulate accounting and to put some costs. First thing, how to define marginal costs is very complicated. It has nothing to do with accounting costs. So from the start, it's not easy to build margin. So in horizontal mergers, we usually go through market shares, because this is an indirect measure of the margins we're looking for. But having said that, I agree that if you want to anticipate problems in a production chain, we want to know how much of the final price is due to the first layer, second layer, and third layer of the production chain. And so, yes, we might want to have an idea of that, although we should be a little bit careful about the possibility of having misleading information.
Sofia, I think you have a compliment.
Yeah, just a quick rebuttal on the VGAP. So last Monday we had a nice keynote speaker coming to the working group, Mr. Moresi. Moresi is a co-author of Moresi and Salop, the VGAP seminal paper, explaining the methodology and the extensions of the methodology. I agree that margins could eventually be manipulated, although we always, apart from the presumption that the information that is shown to Cade is a trustful information, But again, this exercise is not an isolated exercise. I think we have to have quantitative, also qualitative exercises. And moreover, I think using the VGAP shows the direction of the foreclosure, the foreclosure. So if you're talking about input or output foreclosure, the VGAP auxiliates the analysis when we are to see the design of the production chain. So just this very quick compliment on that.
Okay. Professor Ioannis, if you can just make your thoughts about this VGAP analysis and also any other, consideration, maybe internal documents, how does it work? Maybe you have any study case that you can just mention on that?
Yes, thank you. So on the VGAP, I think I share the concerns of the applicability, but I would not also be in favor of completely rejecting or devaluing VGAP as an analysis. I think as any other quantitative technique, VGAP does depend on assumptions, as the UBP and the GAPI does. And it does depend on what variables we put in and the structure of the input and output. But I think it is still valuable to do so, but I would not suggest we use it as a black or white answer. And CMA used it in 2017 in Tesco, Booker and Co-op NISA. But this is part of one, VGAP was part of one of the pieces of evidence that were used in the analysis. And CMA also focused on internal documents to try and combine the quantitative the indications from the quantitative analysis with what exactly the internal documents and other qualitative analysis actually showed. And I believe if the CMA was in front of qualitative evidence, which would be pointing to a different direction to what the quantitative evidence would point to, I would think CMA would have a difficult time blocking a transaction or asking for remedies in a transaction because solely based on VGAP. And there was a research done by an economic consulting. I'm not trying to do marketing of an economic consulting firm here. One of the major economic consulting firms in Europe, at least, did research, and they presented their analysis of the different type of factors that are used by CMA and DG Comp. Hans, you may all know which one I'm talking about, but I can send it to you later on. I should not be doing free marketing for an economic consulting. That's why I cannot say the name. But that economic consulting actually did an analysis of the different factors used by DG Comp and CMA and found that the internal documents are used more heavily by CMA than they do by DG Comp. What they also found is both DG Comp and CMA over time in the last 20 years, they have been placing more emphasis on internal documents compared to the past. So I think internal documents is useful to give the context. They have to be read in the right context, in the right factual context, because you may have board documents or a CEO statement in a board meeting that is there as a statement of a CEO of a company. That potentially should not be read literally because it is told under a specific frame of mind and context. But I think what I find helpful is that authorities, that at least the ones I am familiar with, actually try to combine quantitative and qualitative evidence. And in the lucky scenario that both types of evidence point in one direction, then they have a strong case. In the less lucky scenario, when they point into opposite directions, then the authorities will probably need to make some tough choices. And Hans, you may have faced this type of tough choices in DG Comp, and you may or may not want to actually share some of this if you can.
Thank you, Professor. So it's a very interesting discussion, but let's move to the next topic here. Sofia, in your coordination in Cade, you had a lot of cases involving regulated markets such as financial health sector. Could you bring us your experience from Brazil and pointed out some best practice on that?
So the dance between the antitrust policy and regulation has always been a tough one. As my boss, Alexandre Barreto, has said, and I never forgot this, although Cade is an island of efficiency in the public administration, it cannot refrain from constructing and maintaining its bridges with other institutions. So this idea of having a cooperation has to be the center of this dance, this tango with the regulation and the antitrust policy. So when interacting with the regulatory authorities, my understanding is that we got to take in mind that while Cade worries about competition and sometimes also variables that affect competition, regulatory agencies should look at a wide menu of different variables. In 2019, when Cade updated the law, actually, when Cade issued the law updating the judicial regime for regulatory authorities, it included in Articles 25 to 28 an idea of how this cooperation between regulatory agencies and the agencies included in the antitrust competition policy in Brazil should interact. And when doing so, the law refers to strict cooperation and to the need to prioritize the exchange of experience. Furthermore, it also refers to the need for Cade to require technical opinions from sectorial agencies and to take these documents as subsidies in the analysis of both mergers and also antitrust infractions. So I think the key idea here is that the subsidies that come from these regulatory agencies should be taken as a exogenous variable in our formula. So if we think about the antitrust analysis as a formula, what comes from the antitrust agencies should be taken as an exogenous variable, something that we cannot change. So we have to take into account, and we have to take into account in order to analyze any, restrictions or any bargaining power or any, but again, antitrust and regulation, they are different. One is an ex post, the other is normally ex ante. And I think I confused the both. But the thing is this, so we have to be very careful, and we have to always think about a way that Cade constructs and maintains these bridges with regulatory agencies.
Thank you, Sofia. Brido, do you have any comments on that based on the economic assessment?
The economic assessment. Yeah, perhaps let us think about, like, we have many cases of vertical mergers on regulated markets, healthcare, oil industry, telecom. So perhaps there is something about regulated markets that is special, and the fact is that we usually regulated natural monopolies or markets in which you have a return to scale and probably very few competitors, or a monopoly at some level of the chain. So those are cases in which the antitrust policy must talk directly to the regulatory policy. We can do one thing if that is. We can ask firms to do something that is forbidden. For instance, when we're going to design remedies that is forbidden by the regulatory authority, So yeah, I don't think I have much to comment on how Cade should act together with regulatory agents. I think we should keep our efforts and move on. I think those are important, especially for vertical mergers. The really most cases I have in mind, recent cases I have in mind, happen in regulated markets. And well, in terms of economics, I think the reason might be related to return to scale and this propensity to have few players, to have regulation in sectors in which you tend to have technologies such that you have few players.
Thank you. So let's move to digital markets. Professor Ioannis, how should the merger guidelines analyze digital markets in modern economy? Where do you have like zero price product, multi-site markets in data aggregation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, what we have seen in digital markets is we have actually seen, as you say, a number of different market structures which are outside the traditional remit of what we've seen in the past. So we have very interesting feedback loops and network effects arising, which can affect foreclosure. The other aspect we have seen, which we started to see actually the first time, I think we started to see it now, is in an ongoing case in UK and Digicomp in Microsoft Activision, which we start to see this concept of ecosystem, where we're talking about vertical mergers, but we're talking about vertical mergers now along a whole set of, let's call it supply chain, where companies will have a position at different levels of the supply chain. And then this position, the fact they have a position at different levels of the supply chain, will actually enhance the power they have in the whole ecosystem, as at least the CMA puts it. It's a very novel theory of harm. Has the CMA had to change the guidance to actually deal with that? No, I think the guidance is not easy to adapt every time we have a massive a new development in the type of markets. I think authorities have been very flexible and adaptable to use the same guidance, at least in Europe, to address this type of issues. But I don't expect to see a new guidance, but I expect to see authorities testing the boundaries of how they can use this guidance with this new concept. So we have seen deals in digital markets in Europe, in the UK, the last few years. NVIDIA was mentioned by Hans earlier. Tesco Looker is another one. Facebook Giphy is another one. Norton Avast, and the list can go on and on and on. Microsoft Nuance, we can go on and on and on in the last few years. So I don't expect to see a change in the guidance. I don't think the guidance can be very descriptive, because then where do you stop drafting that guidance, and how descriptive can you make it? How many different possibilities can you take into account at this point in time for what the markets may evolve to be? I think it boils down to how creative the authorities can be in using the guidance they have to actually address issues that arise in new types of markets. So I think for me, at least, what will be interesting to see is whether this new theory of ecosystem on a vertical merger in digital markets, whether it is something that the CMA or the Digicomp is going to endorse. Because if they do endorse it, then that opens up a completely new type of theory of harm, which can affect a number of vertical mergers in digital markets.
Thank you. Hans, do you have any comments on regards to the digital marketing vertical case?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, of course, on the Microsoft Activision case, I cannot comment because it's an ongoing investigation. I mean, as far as these ecosystem theories are concerned, more generally, I think the way that people perceive them, they are often made up of different elements that are maybe old elements, but sort of packaged in a new way. So I don't think this is sort of something that, I mean, I think Ioannis put it very nicely in saying, I mean, guidelines cannot be so prescriptive as to imagine any possible evolution, of the system. But I think the basic underlying principles remain the same. I just wanted to say that, our guidelines certainly, from 14 years ago are a bit short on these sort of dynamic effects. And I think they're very important, these effects, and they're becoming more important. And I think the scope for non-horizontal harm is a lot larger in digital industries. And the reason why is that network effects and scale effects play such a large role. So vertical integration, can potentially lead to a situation where foreclosure really decreases the ability of rivals to compete because their access to some other side of the market or to network effects and so forth is decreased. And if you combine that with the fact that these markets are very dynamic, so you have situations where people are active on one end of the supply chain, and then a couple of years down the line they enter on the other end of the supply chain. I think the scope for foreclosure harm generally is a lot more significant. So I think this is important. This is underemphasized in our own guidelines, and I think the logic that's behind those cases is similar to the logic that you would have in unilateral conduct cases more generally. So we certainly think it's important.
Thank you. Let's move to the topic of efficiencies, including pass-on matters. From two hands again, from your experience, what does the authority should account in terms of pro-competitive effects to outweigh the negative effects on vertical mergers, and how to account to considering the pass-through issue? Do you have any comments and experience on that?
Right. I mean, I think generally, of course, one has to say that, and it was mentioned before on this panel, that vertical mergers, of course, have intrinsically good scope for efficiencies. I mean, I think that has been documented over the decades and centuries, how vertical mergers can lead to better trade between partners by allowing to make relationship-specific investments and organizing production inside the firm sometimes more efficiently. Another thing that is often mentioned and often looked at is the elimination of double marginalization. So the fact that if you combine two complements, once you're in a company, you will realize the more I sell, the more it benefits my merging partner. So you will have an incentive to compete more aggressively. And so this is clearly important. Now, I think especially with elimination of double marginalization, one has to be careful not too quickly to credit it, because the circumstances where it can compensate are perhaps less pervasive than is sometimes claimed by parties. I mean, to just give one example from the case that I was referring to earlier, the Telia-Bonnier case. In this case, essentially everybody who had a television in Sweden was already receiving this TV channel. So what's the logic of elimination of double marginalization? The logic is, if I'm the downstream firm, I sell more, it will help my upstream partner. But if everybody already has the product, I have no reason to lower the price, because I cannot acquire new customers for my upstream partner. So in this situation, when the whole market is covered, it will be very difficult to have that. It's just one example. Now on pass-through, finally, honestly, in our practical work, I've rarely seen a situation where this has been such a big issue, because usually, you can think of both the economic harm, the raising rivals costs, as well as the elimination of double marginalization as changes in the cost structures of the firm. The raising rivals costs will be some cost increase in the vertical chain, and the elimination of double marginalization cost decrease. And the same is true in horizontal mergers. So, to the extent that we say one will be passed on, the other one, will also be passed on. And by and large, I think the basic economic assumption is, if a cost change affects the entire structure, then it will be passed on to some degree. So I think, in fairness, if we say that anti-competitive effects are passed through, I think then we also have to acknowledge that efficiencies will be passed through. I think it would be inconsistent to just structurally always claim that only one is passed through and not the other.
Thank you. Professor Ioannis, do you have any study case that the pass-through to consumer was considered in terms of efficiency analysis?
I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. I'm trying to remember if I have come across a case where the pass-through was explicitly considered. I think I start from a very small sample of cases where efficiencies have been given quite a lot of room for analysis. I cannot think of a pure efficiency defense case which would incorporate a pass-through to consumers, I think, by the European Commission. Hans, again, you can correct me here. I cannot think of, maybe there are some, I cannot think of any. There was one case in UK back in 2007, I think, which has to do with radio stations, global GCAP, where in one of the markets, the London market, the pass-through of the efficiency that the OFT found, the pass-through to the advertisers to these radio stations was quantified, not fully quantified, but at least there was evidence provided that there will be pass-through, but was not quantified explicitly. But it was something that the OFT took into account in that decision. I believe there is an efficiency defense case also accepted by the Dutch authority, the Yellow Pages case. I think there's one more or a couple more in Europe, but it's very rare to see a pure, at least from an outsider's perspective, not within the authority, because authorities may actually have done this analysis, but because they do not actually reach a successful pass-through rate, that's why we probably do not see it in the outside world. So from what we have seen from decisions, I have not seen a clear pass-through analysis on efficiencies yet.
Thank you. We are running out of time. I don't know if people from the audience has any question. Can you just, I think it's over there. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all the panelists for the excellent presentations. Well, my name is Cade. I'm an advisor at the General Superintendent's Office. I'm also part of the working group in vertical analysis. So I would also want to congratulate Sofia and Daniele for the amazing job they are doing running the working group. It's the discussions are being excellent. And well, we had discussed many things about foreclosure, and I know that this is one of the most areas of harm that we have regarding vertical mergers. But I would also want to know, especially for Mr. Zenger and Professor Ioannis, if they also have any points regarding and suggestions on how we assess the discussions on coordinator effects on vertical analysis, please. Thank you.
Hans or Professor,
I can very quickly say something. We don't have many cases on this, honestly, and one of the reasons is that we in Europe we have a very difficult legal standard on coordinated effects, and I will leave Ioannis some room to comment on that because it's a legal question. So practically it's difficult for us even in horizontal cases. Now in vertical cases, I think where the issue sometimes comes up in practice is these sort of hub and spoke cartels where essentially some let's say a retailer is used to coordinate prices between manufacturers, and then they provide information through a triangle, if you will. And this sort of concern, I think, because there are practical cartel cases, usually resale price maintenance cases, combined with information flow from the retailer to the producers to establish high prices everywhere, basically. I mean, this issue then can come up in vertical integration because, of course, it facilitates this. But apart from that, I don't have much experience with it due to this high standard in Europe. Yeah.
very briefly, just coming on from the comment Hans made, I would be surprised if there are more than 12 to 15 coordinated defects cases, horizontal coordinated defects cases in Europe, by European Commission, I mean. It's very difficult test to meet. It's a very difficult test to meet. And I think it would be even more difficult in a vertical context. That doesn't mean that should not be in the guidance, because you always need to have the tools there to apply them if ever you needed to. But I wouldn't expect that you would be spending too much time on that. And if you can actually address the harm through a non-coordinated theory, it's easier, it's safer, it's probably going to be a better choice.
Don't take our test. Do something simpler for Cade.
Maybe Sofia, you have any comments on that, and unless you, Braido, as well.
Yeah, Commissioner Fernandes was just mentioning in the previous panel that it is more difficult for the antitrust authorities to build constructive responses than reactive responses. And I think to tackle that coordinated effects, we have to bear this in mind, because if we are to solve a coordinated effect problem through within a vertical merger, that means that we are to apply some kind of remedy on that, or even not approve the merger because of that. That would be crazy in my point of view. But when thinking on that, my thing is it really what we have to think is the merging parties really merging because of this coordination? Is this the idea of the operation? And so possibly not. And we have reviewed the international guides on this issue, and there's no consensus. Like as Ioannis said, it is not something to put aside on the guide. I think the guide has to mention it or describe it at some point, but there's no consensus on how big is the harm and how often does it come from. So the possibility of exchanging information, we are talking about the possibility of exchanging information either upstream or downstream due to that vertical merger. But the important question we have to ask is whether this information is really sensitive, up to the point that it becomes a competitive advantage to the merging party. I think it isn't. I mean, most of the time it won't be, and if it is, maybe the correct way to address is not through a behavior remedy, because it is difficult to monitor. It's probably not tackling really the problem, if there is a problem. So just to finish that issue of the guidelines and pass to Braido, that he has asked in his first speech, is that a simple way to do vertical merger analysis? Is that a step-by-step procedure that we could adopt for vertical mergers as we do in our age guideline? Vertical mergers are far from being simple. If you think vertical mergers are simple, come to work with us. It's a good way to change your thinking. But we have to tackle the problem. The problem is on the table, and we have to have something. It's not that it's a recipe of how to make the cake, but it is information from our experience, from our case law, that could guide the civil servants on how to analyze and give predictability to the markets, give what the OECD asks us to do. So that's my final say on that, but I'm going to pass you the words. Thank you.
So, sorry. Let me do one comment before going to coordinated effects about double marginalization problem that I was mentioned before. Definitely, this is one of the important deficiencies that are usually alleged on vertical mergers. But there are some contractual ways to solve double marginalization problems, or at least reduce its scope, such as like price caps, which are pro-competitive and could work. So It's just like, although I acknowledge that this is an important deficiency that comes, I'm not sure you need the merger to solve it. I mean, sometimes yes, but sometimes not. And on the coordinated effects issue, so when we're looking at horizontal merger analysis, we usually look to the market share of the four main firms, or five. We here in Brazil, we use the C4 to see whether, I mean, when it reaches about 70% of the market, raise a flag about the possibility. And although we all acknowledge that, we usually do not impose remedies, even in horizontal cases, to prevent that, because you're basically trying to prevent something that is very illegal and it's criminal. I mean, it's not only an antitrust violation; it's a crime in Brazil to do cartels. So yes, of course, every firm will promise not to do anything, but if you want to do a crime. I mean, it won't be this contract or any penalty you impose on this agreement that we will avoid that. When we go to vertical mergers, I think it was Hans who said first. I mean, everybody said about the rub and spoke possibility. Definitely, that is the main concern, right? I mean, now you have an integrated firm. It might be able to see the information on all layers of the productive chain, and perhaps it rises its interest on sharing this information with competitors, and so that takes us to an issue that we didn't discuss much here, but it's very important on vertical mergers. That is the exchange of sensitive information. We usually have remedies for that. I mean, most cases in which we have remedies, there are something about like exchange of sensitive information, and we are usually concerned about fairness and avoiding market foreclosure. I don't want you to share. So, for integrated firm, I don't want you to share information about your competitors. So, let's say in the downstream market, to the upstream firm, or vice versa, depends on where you have more market power. And again, we don't think much about, I mean, what type of information could be shared across players, not within the merged firms. I'll have a thought about that, and to be honest, I don't know. But I mean, this is a very interesting issue. But I'm skeptical about our ability to deal with that. Although it's always interesting to think about cases which we don't know how to solve, right? And so.
Thanks so much. So I think you're already late. I would like to thank so much Professor Ioannis and Hans, Sofia and Braido, especially Hans and Ioannis. I know that's very late in your time zone, so thanks so much for that. E, bom, a gente agora vai ter na sala A o prêmio IA, então a gente agora muda de sala. E depois, às 8h30, vai ter o jantar aqui do IBRAC. E, além disso, temos a divulgação aí de 4 livros, né? O lançamento de 4 livros de inovações disruptivas, controle de concentrações envolvendo fundo de investimento, sanções não pecuniárias do antitruste e o dogma do cartel e seletividade. Obrigada a todos e uma boa tarde.
Muito obrigado.